a musician, a songwriter, a lecturer, a shaman, who wears many hats. His talks have always intrigued us and always will. Today, it's going to be about Algonquins and Unitarians and French philosophers of freedom. Welcome, Evan. Welcome, Evan Pritchard.
So customarily, I always play some flute for a story or a talk, and I'll make it brief. Okay. So, you know I'm a historian. He left that off the list, so I am a professional historian. Anybody ready for a history lesson? Okay, Mike is, okay. Okay, here's your history lesson. Back in the 1950s, I was a member of a Unitarian church studying the kindergarten theology of Dick and Jane, if you know, anybody know? Well, that's another era, but it was in a group called LRY, which means Liberal Religious Youth. So this is another world. And anybody here remember any of those days? Oh, Robin, yes. Then so that was the Unitarians, and there was just one U. There was a U and a U, but no UU. So as a Unitarian, it gives me pride to learn recently that 3 out of the 4 authors of the Declaration of Independence finished their lives as champions of the Unitarian Church. The Declaration is a cool document. It changed the course of world history and something to be proud of. So you know, this is part of all of our collective ancestry spiritually, is the Unitarians. And those 3 particular ones, they weren't really joiners, but well, I'll explain what I'm talking about. The Declaration was the foundation of the Constitution, the premise that it was a good idea for people to have rights and freedoms, especially the right to redress grievances. American colonies were covered by the Magna Carta, but that was only for aristocrats, and hardly anyone in this room would have qualified for protection of individual rights and freedoms under said Magna Carta. But I imagine most of you are U.S. citizens protected by the Constitution and the amendments, Bill of Rights, or you should be. The writing of the Declaration was a moment we moved from Magna Carta to we the people, and the fact that it was mostly the workings of a gang of well-schooled Unitarians should be of interest. But the belief in the rights of the individual comes not so much from Unitarian thought originally, or even French thought originally, but from Algonquin thought, as I shall soon explain. You may not have known that. These 3, first of all, I have to explain the 3 Unitarians, because you may not have known. You may have heard of these people, but may not realize the Unitarians. Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration. Ben Franklin was the editor, and John Adams, the Q-less Adams, by the way, as the political advisor. And we should mention New York's own Robert Livingston III was also in the room where it happened, but he was Presbyterian and had very little to say about the matter. He stands silently within the pediment of the Jefferson Memorial, if you look up, upholding the rights of man and also the eaves of the building. That's a little trivia you can look up. So who were these 3 liberal religious youths, these Unitarians of 1776? Well, Thomas Jefferson never formally joined the Unitarian Church, not a joiner, but by the late 1810s, he clearly identified with Unitarian beliefs and expressed hope that Unitarianism would become the dominant American religion. And you can look that up. He enjoyed regular correspondence with Unitarian leaders such as Dr. Benjamin Waterhouse and the Reverend Joseph Priestley. And quite frequently made comments about Unitarian, his fondness for Unitarian thought. Now, John Adams, you've heard of him, he has a drink, right? His wife, Abigail Adams, attended and were members of the First Parish Church of Quincy, which was then called Braintree, in Massachusetts, which became officially Unitarian in 1750. It's pretty early. And Adams later in life, he wrote, "I'm a church-going animal for 76 years. I'm a Unitarian." I'm not sure that's what they meant by church-going. By the early 19th century, Adams corresponded with Unitarian ministers like Joseph Priestley and William Ellery Channing, affirming his theological alignments. And he was president from 1797 to 1801 with his quasi-Unitarian Jefferson as vice president. So there were two Unitarians in the White House at that point. Ben Franklin, born around 1700, left the Presbyterian Church in his early 20s and declared himself a deist and rejected the idea of the Trinity with Jesus as Son of God. And he continued to speak and write on philosophical matters, and as he did, his views moved closer and closer to that of the Unitarian Universalist Church today, although he never declared membership. Now, these Unitarians all had a great interest in French culture and politics, although Hamilton was not among them. All wore three-cornered hats at some point. Now, my story is the three-cornered story, so I'm going to explain this so you understand why I call it the three-cornered story. Typical style with colonies. However, portraits of John Adams as a delegate to the Continental Congress show him in tri-cornered hats. Franklin wore one as part of his formal diplomatic attire in Paris during the war, and there are portraits of him there in the hats. And Jefferson wore one now and then during the time of the writing of the Declaration, and that is why I call them the first corner of this three-cornered story, which I'm about to tell, the Unitarian corner. But I'm going to proceed to the other two corners. Then there's the French corner. So where do you think Jefferson got his inspiring words describing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as inalienable rights based on natural law? Where does this come from? The French. Both the early Unitarians and the Declaration of Independence were greatly influenced by the French Enlightenment movement. Rousseau and Spinoza were champions of religious tolerance, which inspired Unitarian tolerance. And French Enlightenment philosopher Claude de Saint-Martin, a very interesting man, was famed for his anti-Trinitarian stance. The belief in deism was also a cornerstone of both the French Enlightenment and the development of Unitarianism. But where did they get their ideas about individual rights and individual freedoms? Well, it's a long story, but the best answer is from the Algonquins and Eastern Woodland Indians, which included my own Micmac ancestor Membertou, and the forgotten Skononoke Indians, which were part of the Munsee Confederacy that lived right here, and in Newburgh. They are the third corner. That's the Algonquin corner. New York's own Algonquins entered the picture on April 24th, 1524, when Verrazzano landed the French ship La Dauphine on Staten Island. He then passed through the narrows that now bears his name and entered New York Harbor. And he wrote a detailed description of the Algonquin people for King Francis I of France, who was 30 years old and entering the 10th year of his reign as the Renaissance king. Now, I saw the original in New York's Morgan Library and then republished that, the English, in the diary in my book, Native New Yorkers, published 2002. On page 402, he glowingly describes the Native New Yorkers as follows, quote, "These people are the most beautiful and have the most civil customs that we have found on this voyage. Their eyes are black and alert, and their manner is sweet and gentle, very like the manner of the ancients. They are very generous and give away all they have. They have painted and decorated their various faces with various colors, showing us as a sign of happiness, offering us every help, and performing with their attendants various games to give us pleasure. They observe the full moon and the rising of the Pleiades and many customs derived from the ancients. They live a long time, and they rarely incur illnesses, and we judge that they're very compassionate and charitable towards their relatives, making great lamentations regarding their adversities, and in their grief calling to mind all of their good fortunes." So this is one of the first contacts with these Algonquins from France, because he was working for France. And that gradually gave rise to the French Enlightenment, and I'll explain. Upon reading this, King Francis became obsessed with his dreams of establishing a terra nova, a new land where Europeans and Native Americans could live together in harmony. Now, Thomas Chambers, who is considered the founder of Kingston, had a similar idea when he and a group of Esopus Munsee created Wiltwyck, which was to become Kingston, by creating a farm on the Esopus River in 1651, part of which is now Seed Song Farm, which I mentioned earlier, currently defending their constitutional rights. Unfortunately, the king, who had crossed the Alps a year earlier to capture Milan, was injured in battle and imprisoned in Madrid and put aside for a year his dream about Terra Nova. Meanwhile, Verrazano returned safely to Dieppe, France, but then was killed by Spanish forces in 1527, which discouraged the cause of Terra Nova for just a few years. But in January 1526, King Francis had been released from prison while recovering from his injuries. This is the steamy part of the story. He was to meet a person who would reignite his dreams for a better world in the West, one who would literally set the stage for the French Enlightenment and become one of the most powerful figures in all Europe. This meeting would change his life and the course of Western civilization. And who he met was a sharp-witted 17-year-old girl, a French maid, a maid of honor named Anne de Pissalot. They don't always tell you about this in the history books, but they fell apparently in love, but he was already in a marriage of convenience with Queen Claude, who was the daughter of King Louis XII. So we don't really know. King Francis was already a humanist, his leading intellectual, and was the patron saint of, the patron, literally, of the humanist satirist Rabelais. And the humanists also come into the Unitarian history. The two were good friends. They were the same age. He was also friends with the Dutch humanist, Erasmus, who had studied at the University of Paris and whose satirical On Praise of Folly was a bestseller. Later, Erasmus became a champion of the cause of indigenous sovereignty when he took on the Sami nation's successful struggle for freedom from Sweden, and a cultural renaissance as well, inspired by King Francis. Now, I myself played a direct part in Sami culture preservation in 2018, but that's another story. Da Vinci had died in young King Francis's arms 7 years earlier, at least according to the painting by Ingres. The learned French king, now I mentioned there's a lot more to that story, but that's another whole talk about his great relationship with Da Vinci. This king who had inherited the Mona Lisa from Leonardo, he was no fool, once said of Anne de Pissalot, he said, she is the most beautiful of learned ladies and the most learned of beautiful ladies. As far as I know, it was Anne that established this tradition called the soirée, the evening parties of artists, poets, and philosophers that go on to this very day, sort of like our coffee time in the church here. According to Etymology World, in the 17th century, the French language adopted the word soirée, altered its meaning to specifically denote an evening gathered for social and entertainment purposes. In its revival, its roots in ancient Greece are to be acknowledged and help define the French Renaissance. So the soirée, also known as the salon in France after 1664, which was a large room in a palace, perhaps the Fontainebleau, became the heart of the Enlightenment movement in France and then in England and then all over Europe. And the desire for enlightened reason was rejection of wars over religion. Native Americans say, and this is a quote with no source, but only an unenlightened man would argue over God. The rewards to humankind for a little invention were incalculable. For example, just one example, in 1764, an 8-year-old Mozart found a ready-made audience in the salons of Paris that helped him rise to stardom. You can see some of that in Amadeus, the movie. So conversations and lectures at these soirees helped to establish an almost unbroken line of freedom-loving social critics writing in the French language, comparing Eastern woodlands culture to most favorably compared to French culture. And this is, if you read The Dawn of Everything, you'll see this is an extraordinary phenomenon where almost all of these French writers did mention our woodland Indians as a good example. How much of this praise for Algonquin culture is warranted is open to debate, and of course it was for 300 years. But not only did it enlighten French politics, it set it on fire, led to the American and French revolutions. Now, Thomas Paine, you remember him, whose book, Common Sense, lit the fuse for the American Revolution when it came out. That was in January of 1776, 6 months before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Spent the 1790s involved with the French Revolution. He was involved in drafting the ultimate manifesto of the French Enlightenment, which was called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, adopted by France in 1789. He then published The Rights of Man in 1791, and this is a book you might still want to read today, perhaps in secret, dedicated to Thomas Jefferson's friend, Marquis de Lafayette. So Unitarian First Lady Abigail Adams later hosted somewhat plainer versions of those French soirees in salons in her own home, both before and during the Adams presidency, unknowingly following Anne de Pisselot's footsteps. So that's why I talked about her, because she's pretty important. Okay? Are you giving me a time stamp? Oh, 5. That's all I got? Okay. Okay. Revolutionary ideas that come out of the French salons of Paris, ideas that inspired the American Revolution, but Abigail's soirees were equally effective and usually included as guests some of the leading figures of the American Revolution. Now, King Francis I, going back to him, he sent Jacques Cartier to Canada. He returned with remarkable descriptions of Algonquin people from Prince Edward Island to St. Lawrence in Newfoundland and their freedom-loving ways. So these are some of my ancestors. The king sent him right back to collect more descriptions of these independent people with so much freedom. Cartier went to Montreal in 1535 and traded with the Iroquois. And in 1541, he made his third voyage and established the city of Quebec and further explored the St. Lawrence River, all during King Francis's reign. And Cartier wrote frequently in praise of their primordial freedoms. So how does the political philosophy of Algonquins relate to this 300-year-long cry for freedom, for liberté, égalité, and fraternité? Well, it is, in fact, its wellspring. Each of the famous Enlightenment thinkers quoted the accounts of explorers among either the Algonquin or their Huron allies and what they had to say about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's look at if I have time to do an outline for this. Let me outline the French Enlightenment. First, there was the humanist Rabelais, who made grotesque satire of French culture and emphasized the joys and freedoms of native culture. He mentions Native Americans in his novels based on these sketchy descriptions coming from the explorers. Then comes Montaigne, who's born in the year of Rabelais' death, the father of the essay. You probably read about him in school. This Enlightenment figure was an inspiration to the third one on the list, Descartes, whose critiques shaped the thinking of French politics and are still the basis of much liberal politics today. And then Molière followed and became known as a great novelist. And Jean Racine continued from there, bringing back the French Renaissance tradition from King Francis. And then, 1623, Brother Gabriel Sagard, who was very important, he wrote Le Grand Voyage du Pays de Huron, 99 years after Verrazano landed. Very important book. Later Enlightenment philosophers such as Locke and Voltaire based their views on Aboriginal life largely on Sagard's scintillating bestseller called A Long Journey in Huron Country, the same book. Sagard wrote of this Wendat people, or the Huron. They have no lawsuits and take little pains to acquire goods in this life, for which we Christians torment ourselves so much, and for our excessive and insatiable greed in acquiring them we are justly and with reason reproved by their quiet life and their tranquil dispositions. In Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wenrow say the Wendat were particularly offended by the French lack of generosity. Sagard was surprised and impressed by his host's eloquence and powers of reasoned argument, skills honed by public discussions of communal affairs. His hosts, in contrast, often remarked on the way the French seemed to be constantly scrambling over each other and cutting each other off in conversation, employing weak arguments, and not showing themselves to be particularly bright. We can see this kind of thing on TV every day, and the new normal today. So they said people who tried to grab the stage, denying others the means to present their arguments, were acting in much the same way as those who grabbed the material means of subsistence and refused to share it. So Sagard was also one of the first to talk about social cohesion achieved through reasoned debate, persuasive argument, and establishment of social consensus. And these were carried through in the Jesuit relations, highly characteristic of French Enlightenment. So the Catholic Church of France, alarmed at the growing influence of these pagans, sent armies of Jesuits to North America and wrote a 71-volume book called Jesuit Relations. And I read 2 of them, and I did find it fascinating talking about that. So let me go. Number 9 is Father Lalemant about the sense of independence among the people. He says, I do not believe there is any people on earth freer than they, and less able to allow the subjectation of their wills to any power, so much so that fathers here have no control over their children or captains over their subjects. But then he admitted it created much less disorder than in France. So this all became very widely read. One of the main complaints of the Jesuits was the equality of the sexes, and then the woodlands that they enjoyed, and of course, which Abigail Adams wanted to enjoy as well and said so. So then, one more, number 10 here. Lo Hontan was a 17-year-old who joined the French army, posted in Canada, and became the deputy to Count de Frontenac. He became a political enemy of the Jesuits, so that many native leaders were very willing to share with him their critiques of Christians. Quote, one day he met the muskrat, Candiaran. This is kind of a highlight in the book, Dawn of Everything, which was a bestseller. Candiaran, the muskrat, becoming an outcast from French society, that La Hontan landed in the court of Hanover, which he got taken in by Leibniz. He had written a book about this conversations he had with Candiaran called Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense Who Has Traveled, came out in 1703, and became an outrageous bestseller before his death. And La Hontan writes, the name of savages which we bestow upon them would fit ourselves better, since there is nothing in our actions that bears an appearance of wisdom. That's getting more and more true all the time. Candiaran casts a uniquely aboriginal criticism of Christian beliefs that God incarnated on earth, entraping himself in a human body for the benefit of only one species, that of the hopelessly imperfect human one. And what about the animals and the birds? Candiaran's criticism, European monetary system are legendary, but typical of free-thinking peoples. And here's a quote that I love. To imagine one can live in a country of money and preserves one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. That's pretty strong language. So was he exaggerating, or was he simply going over the top because he could and never lose this thread of the truth? On top of Mount Royal, there is a beautiful overlook spot with a view of the whole city of Montreal called Candiaran Belvedere, in honor of the Huron sage. In 1701, just before his death, he brought a generation of peace to Canada at a spot that can be seen just below that overlook. And recent threats to peace from the southern direction are giving rise to the eventual battle cry of Quebec, which is Je me souviens, or me, I remember. But what do they remember? Hopefully, they're remembering the wisdom of Candiaran and the book by La Hontan. So I'll stop there if we're out of time. Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening.